Imagine the crisp, unforgiving morning of April 18, 1943. High above the sprawling, sun-drenched expanse of the Pacific Ocean, near the remote Solomon Islands, a formation of 16 profoundly bizarre fighter aircraft is skimming just feet above the cresting waves in a terrifyingly fast, ultra-low altitude sprint. They do not look like any conventional fighter of the era. Gone are the rounded, teardrop-shaped fuselages. Instead, what tears through the salt-heavy air is a machine that looks entirely alien. Two impossibly elongated, slender tail booms flanking a central, pod-like cockpit that seems ripped straight from the pages of a pulp science fiction magazine. This is no routine combat patrol. This is a top-secret, high-stakes assassination mission codenamed Operation Vengeance, and their target is the mastermind of Pearl Harbor himself, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto of the Japanese Combined Fleet. Intercepting a specific enemy, commander in the boundless void of the Pacific sky, after hours of radio silent, flying seemed like an absolute mathematical impossibility. Yet, amidst the deafening roar of these metallic beasts, the impossible was about to be violently rewritten into history. This radically unorthodox warplane, a machine that fundamentally shattered mankind's preconceived notions of aviation design, was the legendary, terrifying P-38 Lightning. Today, we are going to strip away the decades of myth, dive into the heavily guarded secrets of its creation, and dissect the beautiful madness behind this revolutionary machine of war. To truly understand this mechanical leviathan, we have to turn the clock back to the late 1930s. The clouds of war were gathering over Europe, and the United States military issued a set of requirements for a high-altitude interceptor that bordered on absolute fantasy. They demanded a fighter capable of reaching a blistering top speed of 360 miles per hour at high altitude, and it had to be able to claw its way from the runway to 20,000 feet in a mere 6 minutes. In an era where aviation was still practically in its adolescence, these numbers were considered pure lunacy. Almost no established aircraft manufacturer believed a single-engine design could ever meet these draconian standards. Planes like the early P-40 Warhawk were simply running out of breath and muscle when pushed into the freezing, oxygen-starved realms of the upper stratosphere. The conventional path was a dead end. To break the ceiling of aviation, someone had to completely break the rules. Enter a young, brilliant, and notoriously stubborn visionary. His name was Kelly Johnson. When he took the helm of this seemingly doomed project, he was just 27 years old. At an age where most engineers were still drafting minor subassemblies, Johnson had already proven himself a prodigy and was serving as Lockheed's chief research engineer. He was a man who absolutely despised bureaucratic red tape and conventional thinking. The tight-knit, secretive engineering group he spearheaded would eventually evolve into the legendary Skunk Works, the mythic birthplace of aeronautical miracles like the U-2 spyplane and the Mach 3S, our 71 Blackbird. Faced with the military's impossible demands, the young engineer looked at the blueprints and made a swift decision. If one engine isn't enough to drag a plane to those heights at those speeds, then we will simply strap on two. But make no mistake, the P-38 was not just engines crudely bolted onto a standard airframe. Johnson and his team birthed a true scientific monster. To survive and thrive in the impossibly thin air of high altitudes, the P-38 was equipped with two massive, liquid-cooled Allison V-1710 engines. But the real magic lay in what was attached to them. Lockheed integrated gigantic, incredibly complex turbochargers directly into those iconic wind booms. These turbochargers acted like massive mechanical lungs. It was an incredibly convoluted and visually intimidating setup, a labyrinth of piping, impellers, and intercoolers that greedily sucked in the thin stratospheric air, compressed it, and rammed it into the engines. This ensured that while enemy fighters were gasping for breath and losing power above 20,000 feet, the Lightning could still roar with full, terrifying fury. It gave the P-38 an almost godlike high-altitude advantage. But pushing mechanical engineering to the absolute tragged edge meant that this plane would exact a heavy, sometimes deadly, toll on the men who flew it. The most immediate and visceral consequence of this design was the bone-chilling, lethal cold. Picture this: you are flying at 30,000 feet, where ambient temperatures can easily plunge to 50 degrees below zero. In a standard fighter, the massive engine is right in front of your feet, acting as a giant, radiating heater. But in Kelly Johnson's twin-boom masterpiece, those two roaring, heat-generating V-12 engines were positioned far out on the wings, completely isolated from the central pilot pod. This brilliantly freed up the nose for visibility and weaponry, but it meant absolutely no engine heat reached the cockpit naturally. While engineers did install a convoluted ducting system meant to siphon warm air from the engines into the cockpit, it was notoriously ineffective and prone to failure. Pilots were essentially trapped in a flying aluminum icebox. They had to battle not just the seasoned aces of the Luftwaffe or the Imperial Japanese Navy, but also crippling frostbite, frozen oxygen masks, and severe hypothermia. For early P-38 pilots, the freezing altitudes were a psychological and physical nightmare. Yet, this monster earned its terrifying reputation primarily because of what was housed inside that uniquely empty nose. Traditional World War II fighters, like the elegant British Spitfire or the rugged American Mustang, had their heavy machine guns spread out along the width of their wings. This standard layout carried a fundamental, unavoidable flaw: the wing-mounted guns had to be angled inward to intersect at a specific distance, the convergence point. At that exact range, the firepower was devastating, but if the enemy plane was closer or further away than that magic number, your bullets would effectively spray wildly in a shotgun pattern, drastically reducing lethality. Kelly Johnson entirely eliminated this problem. Taking full advantage of the central cockpit pod, he took for heavy .50 caliber machine guns and one devastating 20mm cannon and packed them tightly side by side, directly in the nose of the aircraft. The result was apocalyptic. There was no convergence point. The P-38 fired an absolute, dead-straight laser beam of laden explosive shells. Whether an enemy was 100 yards away or 1,000 yards away, if they were caught in that concentrated stream, they were instantly pulverized. But this also demanded the marksmanship of a sniper without the spread of wing guns. A P-38 pilot had to aim with surgical precision, or completely miss the target. But the focused firepower is only the beginning of the Lightning's genius. We must now delve into one of the most brilliant, yet logistically cursed, aerodynamic secrets of this aircraft. In the era of massive, high-horsepower propeller-driven fighters, every pilot of a single-engine plane wrestled with a relentless physical demon, Engine Orc. When a massive propeller spins furiously in one direction, Newton's third law dictates that an equal and opposite force strives to violently twist the entire airplane in the opposite direction. During takeoff, steep climbs, or aggressive, edge-of-the-envelope dogfights, this immense twisting force would constantly try to pull the plane off course. Pilots had to constantly, exhaustingly fight the rudder pedals just to keep the aircraft flying straight, draining their precious stamina in the heat of combat. But look again at Kelly Johnson's twin-headed beast. In a stroke of absolute, reverse engineering brilliance, Lockheed didn't just install two engines, they made them spin in opposite directions. The P-38 was outfitted with counter-rotating propellers. The left engine drove its propeller to the right, and the right engine drove its propeller to the left. Those two immense, fuselage-twisting torque forces met in the middle and perfectly, beautifully canceled each other out. What did this mean for the pilot? It meant the P-38 was a phenomenally stable gun platform. Regardless of how fast it was diving, climbing, or accelerating, it flew exactly where it was pointed, without the slightest hint of torque-induced yaw. It hovered in the air like an immovable sniper's nest. The pilot didn't have to wrestle the rudder. They could dedicate 100% of their mental and physical bandwidth to putting the crosshairs directly over the enemy. It granted the Lightning unparalleled straight-line stability and lethal long-range accuracy. However, in the brutal calculus of war, perfection is incredibly expensive. To achieve this aerodynamic harmony, Lockheed created a logistical nightmare. Because the engines spun in opposite directions, their internal components, crankshafts, camshafts, gears, and the propellers themselves were entirely mirrored. They were absolutely incompatible with each other. Imagine being an overworked, grease-stained mechanic on a muddy, mosquito-infested airstrip in New Guinea. AP-38 lands with a blown-out right engine. You rush to the supplied depot, only to find a massive crate of brand-new, beautifully machined engines, and every single one of them is a left-turning model. Your grounded fighter is now a useless paperweight. This uncompromising pursuit of performance over parts commonality haunted the P-38 throughout its service life, keeping maintenance crews in a perpetual state of frustration and leading to lower than desired operational readiness rates. But logistical headaches pale in comparison to the aerodynamic horror that awaited P-38 pilots in the upper atmosphere. As Kelly Johnson's creation pushed the boundaries of aviation engineering, it accidentally awakened a terrifying physical phenomenon that science hadn't fully mapped out yet. Imagine this horrifying scenario. You are patrolling alone at 25,000 feet. You spot a formation of enemy bombers far below. You push the yoke forward, the twin V-12s scream, and the massive airframe begins a near vertical plummet toward the Earth. The airspeed indicator spins wildly, 400 miles per hour, 450, 500. The wind noise becomes a deafening, demonic shriek. And then, without warning, the plane feels as if it has smashed into an invisible concrete wall. This was the dreaded compressibility crisis, a term early P-38 pilots spoke of only in hushed, terrified whispers. The P-38 was simply too fast for its own good. During a steep dive, the air accelerating over the thickest part of its wings was actually reaching the speed of sound. The air could no longer flow smoothly. Instead, it compressed violently, forming a brutal, invisible wall of pressure known as a shockwave. This localized sonic boom not only destroyed the wing's lift but created a massive, violent wake of turbulent air that slammed directly into the horizontal tail section. The result was instantaneous and lethal. The tail lost all lift, and the aircraft's nose pitched down violently in an uncontrollable maneuver known as Mach tuck. Imagine the sheer panic in the cockpit. The pilot is screaming toward the earth or the ocean, pulling back on the control column with every ounce of their physical strength. But under the immense pressure of that transonic shockwave, the controls feel like they have been set in solid cement. They simply will not move. The aircraft becomes a runaway train falling down a bottomless elevator shaft. Tragically, in the early years of the war, countless brilliant young American pilots didn't die from enemy gunfire, but simply vanished, pulverized against the earth by the unforgiving laws of supersonic aerodynamics. It wasn't until later variants, when the stubborn Kelly Johnson finally admitted the flaw and installed electrically operated dive flaps under the wings to alter the airflow and break the shockwave, that pilots were finally able to regain control and pull out of these supersonic death dives. Even when not battling the sound barrier, everyday combat in a P-38 was like walking a tightrope over a razor wire. The irony of the freezing cockpit was that the engines themselves ran volcanically hot. To keep the massive V-1710s from melting themselves into slag, Lockheed had to route the cooling systems all the way back through those iconic booms. This created incredibly long, highly vulnerable coolant lines spanning the length of the aircraft. In a frantic dogfight, you didn't need a heavy 20mm cannon shell to take down a Lightning. A single, lucky 7.7mm machine gun bullet from a nimble enemy fighter, a bullet that might pass harmlessly through the wing of another fighter, could easily sever one of these pressurized coolant lines. Within minutes, the vital fluids would boil away into the slipstream. The incredibly expensive, highly engineered engine would rapidly overheat, seize up violently, and potentially explode in a catastrophic fireball mid-air. And if the worst happened, if the plane was hopelessly crippled, engulfed in flames, and the pilot had to bail out, the P-38 revealed its final, most macabre trap. In a standard fighter, bailing out was perilous but straightforward. Jettison the canopy, unbuckle, and roll out over the side, letting the slipstream carry you away. But bailing out of the central pod of a P-38 was a high-stakes gamble with death. Stretching right behind the pilot, connecting the two massive engine booms, was the horizontal stabilizer. To the pilots, it was known as the meat slicer. If a pilot simply jumped out normally into the high-speed slipstream, there was a very real, horrific probability that the wind would slam them directly into the metal leading edge of the tail, killing them instantly. To survive, P-38 pilots had to invent a terrifyingly counterintuitive maneuver. They had to use whatever control they had left to roll the burning aircraft completely upside down. Only when inverted could they pop the canopy, release their harnesses, and simply let gravity drop them straight down, pulling them safely under the deadly arc of the tail section. Despite its brutal, anti-human flaws, its logistical nightmares, the terror of compressibility, and the lethal acrobatics required just to escape a dying airframe, the P-38 Lightning carved an immortal, blood-stained legacy into the history of aerial warfare. It was never a perfect aircraft, but it was a machine that pushed specific performance metrics to the absolute zenith of its era. Its twin-engine layout provided a massive fuel capacity and a safety margin for over-water flights that no single engine fighter could ever match. This made it the undisputed king of the vast, unforgiving expanses of the Pacific theater, uniquely capable of executing the long-range bomber escorts, sweeping fighter sweeps, and strategic assassination missions that defined the war against Japan. This is why, on that fateful morning in 1943, only the P-38 had the range and the firepower to intercept Admiral Yamamoto. It is why America's acer Richard Bong achieved his staggering 40 confirmed kills entirely from the cockpit of a Lightning. Transitioned from a wildly ambitious sketch on an engineer's drafting board into the fork-tailed Devil, a machine that struck genuine terror into the hearts of Axis pilots across the globe. It proved that when faced with the limits of physics, unconventional, borderline insane engineering could unleash devastating results. Kelly Johnson and his team of visionary engineers used thousands of rivets, sheets of aluminum, and an unyielding will to construct a deeply flawed but undeniably glorious instrument of war that permanently altered the trajectory of aviation. Today, when we stand in a museum and gaze up at that futuristic central pod and those elegant, elongated booms, we aren't just looking at an airplane. We are looking at a monument to human audacity, a testament to the beautiful, terrifying madness of the pursuit of the sky. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the beautiful madness of aviation history, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more. I'm your history and engineering guide, and I'll see you in the next episode.